The apparent prosperity and the remarkable successes of the emperors Kangxi and Yongzheng in consolidating China's borders and centralizing the administration should not blind us to the fact that China was still far from being a fully integrated or homogeneous market or country. China's vast expanses meant endless variations in such areas as pace of economic change, types of lineage organizations, efficiency of transportation, religious practices, commerce, and patterns of land use and landholding. By analyzing late imperial China in terms of units of economic integration, rather than through the traditional provincial and prefectural subdivisions, political subdivisions, we gain a different perspective on the society based on a body of data that was not available to the rulers and bureaucrats of the time. Administrative boundaries generally are at least loosely based upon real economic conditions, but political factors will often cause the state's structure to differ slightly or majorly from what would be consistent with economic reality, which can cause inefficiency. This is what we shall call non-correspondence. The usual village, perhaps 100 households, was below the market level and not self-sufficient. Its real community thus was centered on the market town, which was of course within walking distance no more than a few miles away, so that a family member might go there and return on a market day. The lowest level, or standard market town, was usually surrounded by a dozen or perhaps up to 18-20 villages, totaling perhaps 1,500 households, 7,000 people-ish. From one of these village households, an able-bodied male through the years might visit the market town a few hundred or thousands of times, and thus have an opportunity to meet a large proportion of the market community. The basis of this community was not only economic, aka the exchange of surplus farm or handicraft products from the village for paper, iron implements, ceramic ware, or other imports from the wider market, but also social. Since many villages were dominated by a single lineage kinship group, families were encouraged to seek brides in other villages, usually through market town matchmakers. A secret society lodge could also be present, and it would normally be centered on the market town. The peasant in the market town could also meet any members of the local ruling class officialdom in the market town, because the villages were generally administered by particularly wealthy members of the lineage group, within which there could be quite a significant wealth disparity. One family could perhaps be very, very rich, but most of the others in the lineage and the clan would be perhaps poor or, normal, having normal standards of living, and obviously the members more wealthy would be administering the whole village. It's important to note that the magistrates, the government officials, were forbidden from serving in their province of birth, and they had both personal and local staff and collaborators. In any region which could perhaps have up to hundreds of thousands of inhabitants, the magistrate was actually the only commissioned representative of the central government, officially. His associates, assistants, were actually not technically government officials, they were his personal employees. And he would begin his tenure lacking any social capital or relationship networks called guanxi. So he had to closely cooperate with the local gentry to administer his jurisdiction. Thus, the Chinese government was very centralized when it came to the officials, but it actually left most of the responsibilities and functions of day-to-day governance to local gentry and non-gentry landed elites who were supposed to cooperate with the government officials. Balance might thus be struck between the imperial official coming in, the outsider, who represented the government, and the indigenous gentry and landlords that represented local interests, through which the official had to handle the problems of his territory. Going above the local level of government organizations, scholars have divided the empire's core territory into 9 economic macro-regions, each embracing parts of several provinces. Each macro-region had a core defined by a heightened level of economic activity in perhaps major cities, and each core was surrounded by a periphery of less developed and populated areas, often with also unfortunate geography, which isolated the core of a given macro-regions from the ones of its neighbors, thus preventing the market from being fully connected. And also it represented this periphery a loosely policed area where illegal sects, secret societies, or bandits could develop in relative freedom. Of these 9 macro-regions, one was in the northeast, in the area of Manchuria, the Qing's pre-conquest heartland. Chinese settlement in the region, which lay beyond the Great Wall, predated the Qing conquest, but was limited only to the southernmost province of the Free, alternatively called Fengjian, Liaodong, or Liaoning. In fact, the mixing of Manchu and Chinese society had allowed Nurhaci, the Qing dynasty's founder, to get acquainted with China before launching his conquest. Nurhaci's power base was itself centered on this frontier of the Ming dynasty, but the Manchu domain extended far into the expanses of Manchuria's two other modern-day provinces, Heilongjiang and Jilin, and into regions as far as Lake Baikal and the future Russian Maritime Province. Vastly but mostly empty domains, sparsely populated by various Manchu tribes after over 1 million Manchus were moved to China during the conquest to consolidate the dynasty's power over the population. The population of Manchuria as a whole by the end of the 18th century barely exceeded 1 million inhabitants, and even agriculture wasn't widespread. The Qing government maintained a monopoly on traditional industries such as hunting and ginseng gathering, but this arrangement wasn't enough to fully exploit the economic possibilities of the region. This, combined with the slow demographic pressure on agriculture in China proper due to the population growth of the Kangxi period, which saw China's population rise by at least a quarter to 150 million people, meant that more and more officials by now were simply unable to control the rising amount of migrants crossing the Willow Palisade, simply looking the other way and contented themselves with taxing the much-needed settlers. For Manchuria to fully develop economically in its own right, however, we will have to wait until the advent of modern communications, the steamship and railway in the late 19th century, which will allow a truly colossal migration of labor to the region, backed up by rising Japan's capital. For now, in the 18th century, Manchuria remains but a wild frontier. Two more regions were in the north, in the Beijing Western Shandong area, and another in the Xi'an region, the northwest. Moving south from Manchuria, we head into agricultural society, where the vast majority of the population was engaged in agriculture since time immemorial, and interacted with the wider market in the manner already described in the beginning of the video. Tenancy, where rentier landlords rented out land to peasants to farm independently, was the dominant form of property, but small family property did exist. However, it was subject to fragmentation because the Chinese traditional inheritance system, unlike that of Europe, tended to divide the land equally between male sons. This land as a whole, the North China Plain, which was centered around the Huanghe, the Yellow River, had been the cradle of Chinese civilization for 3,000 years until the Song dynasty, when the empire's center of gravity had begun to gradually shift south. The Beijing macroregion includes most of the North China Plain, centered around the Yellow River all the way to the mountains of Shandong, and extending into Henan and northern Jiangsu provinces. Despite the presence of the capital city, it was less urban than most other macroregions within China proper. Small independent holdings were the economic norm. Flooding was common, brought on by the Yellow River, but flood relief measures and emergency grain distribution in times of famine were more effective than in regions farther from the capital. Cotton was becoming a valuable cash crop of this macroregion as both spinning and weaving techniques proved more efficient, often carried out in home-based seller workshops. Periodically, the region was also affected by disastrous droughts due to its lower water supply, a problem which actually exists to this day. Tobacco cultivation was spreading as well, along with glassmaking, coal mining, and brewing. Shifting social conditions, such as the lowering supply of land and the presence of many laborers and boatmen, who were traditionally an outcast group, who serviced the grain barges on the Grand Canal that transported grain from the fertile Yangtze region to the south to the capital to the north, along with overworked soil and fragmented land holdings, all contributed to make this area an area where crime and local violence were becoming more and more common. The next macro-region was the northwestern one. It encompassed the western mountainous part of Shanxi Province, Shanxi Province, Gansu Province, and parts of Inner Mongolia. This region, more than any other, was affected by the strategic necessities of the state, as it sat on the western edge of the old Ming territory and at the rough boundary between sedentary Chinese civilization and steppe pastoral nomads. Only by the Kangxi era, the Qing had begun to push the frontier further outward with the complete integration of the south after the Free Feudatories Revolt and the Jungar Wars pushing the border west. Military necessities like subsidized importation of grain and maintenance of infrastructure thus played a larger role than in other regions, especially in the western province Gansu, which, while one of the largest in China, was also one of the poorest due to its low rainfall and consequently low agricultural productivity. Even as far as the late 1880s, the cultivated area was less than 3% of the total land. The Gansu Shanxi area thus had to rely on its position to afford ancient trade routes. As soon as Gansu became the gateway to the newly pacified Xinjiang province during the Qiandong era, merchants lined up to travel through the province to the markets of Central Asia. Near the North China Plain, Shanxi set forth a macro-regional boundary. Water and trade routes linked the eastern part of the province to the coastal plain, while the Fen River, which drained into the upper Yellow River Basin, dominated its western, mountainous part. The province that resulted had to have some agriculturally productive valley land. However, that was part of the northern China region. Much of it was actually a sort of mountainous border region. As for its own economy, the coal, iron, and salt mining operations remained of prime importance. But its wealthiest subjects were actually merchants who underwrote long-distance trade throughout the empire. Hohhot, an inner Mongolian city straight to the north of Shanxi, was the hub for the trade with Mongolia, and consequently with Russia. Shanxi was also the birthplace of Chinese banking, Piaohao, and Shanxi became home to long-lived banking and trading families. The Yangtze River is one of the longest navigable rivers in the world, and is probably the greatest existing natural highway, connecting China all the way from the Sichuan interior highlands to its delta region in eastern China. Although the birthplace of China as a civilization is the Yellow River Valley, since Song times, its fortunes have been made on the Yangtze. The insane scale of the river, which in Chinese is called the Changjiang, or Long River, is itself daunting in terms of economic and political geography. The distance, as the crow flies, from its origin in Sichuan to Shanghai, where the river flows into the Pacific Ocean, is roughly 1,600 kilometers, which is comparable to the distance between Berlin and Moscow. In the macro-regional model that we are using, the river's course is divided between 3 economic regions: upper, middle, and lower. The lower Yangtze region sits between Jiangsu, Zhejiang, Anhui provinces. It has historically been one of the richest regions in the country due to the many boons provided by the extensive river network, not just the Great Yangtze River, but others, in the fields of transportation and agriculture. This is the region that awed Marco Polo with its luxurious cities. To supplement their income from rice farming, which was diminishing due to overcrowding and fragmentation of holdings, households in the region increasingly were turning to other industries such as mat weaving near the city of Ningbo, cotton cultivation and weaving near Shanghai, medicine making, and silk throughout the entire region. The transport network was more efficient than average, which allowed the supporting of a higher population density and a higher percentage of cash crops in cultivation. Jiangsu and Zhejiang provinces were the first in China proper to become grain deficient, meaning that they imported more than they produced. To pay for these grain imports, the whole Jiangnan region, as it was known, south of the Yangtze River, sold its handicraft products outside the region, contributing to the nationwide escalation of long-distance interregional trade. Commercialization in the whole region was high thanks to this transport network, allowing those involved in the artisan goods trade, especially cotton cloth, to sometimes visit the market towns daily from their countryside homes, a phenomenon which was unthinkable in most pre-industrial economies. In the whole of Jiangnan, the high level of absentee proprietorship developed, with many of the largest landowning families moving permanently to urban settings. And the high degree of commercialization of the countryside meant that even gentry degree holders were heavily involved in trade, something which was taboo elsewhere in China. Ningbo emerged as a major export center in Zhejiang, because Wenzhou, the province's second major port, was cut off by mountains from inland transport, and later the city of Ningbo became one of China's first coastal banking centers. In modern times, Shanghai is the undisputed economic center of this region, but before the treaty port system, which opened Shanghai to Western trade, the city had been secondary in importance, as it mainly connected the regional market to the northern trade with Manchuria and the capital, rather than the more developed southern trade routes of Ningbo. The reason why the northern trade with the capital region wasn't as developed as you may think is the Grand Canal, which was a massive transportation canal project dating back centuries that ran from the city of Hangzhou to Beijing. The main purpose of this canal was to ship grain from central and southern China to the capital and northern regions, which were more arid and thus had a less productive agriculture. This was probably China's single most important infrastructure project, and it had been in operation in one form or another since Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor, reigned in the 3rd century BCE. He was the one that initiated the construction of this project. Even though in his time the route was actually very different, it changed over time quite a lot. And in many ways, it is even more important to Chinese history than its more well-known imperial mega-project cousin, the Great Wall. While the Grand Canal was undoubtedly effective, its presence stymied the development of sea transport. By contrast, the Middle Yangtze macroregion, with its comparatively low population density and its unfilled land, was at this time experiencing a massive in-migration from other regions and the growth of the grain market. The area developed a population of guest families, with divided loyalties to their new base and their old ancestral homes, and of disaffected local minorities pushed off their former lands. The booming Yangtze River city of Hankou, a commercial rather than administrative center with complex systems of banks and guilds, was becoming the focus for a truly interregional long-distance grain trade along the river. Other commodities that came through Hankou were coming upstream on the Yangtze River from Sichuan province. To the southeast, Jingdezhen expanded as a fast expanding industrial city, making porcelain for the export markets of the West as well as the Chinese elite. Yet, along with this commercial growth, peasant strategies of building new dikes in the area of Dongting Lake to protect their tiny plots of farmland from floods, along with larger-scale land reclamation projects engineered by the local elite, led ultimately to terrible flooding by the rivers, which had been deprived of their natural runoff areas by man's hard work and ingenuity. This came about because Hunan province, where the lake was, had become a center of rice production and exported heavily to other provinces through the Xiang River and Dongting Lake, which connect to the Yangtze River and to the downstream center of Hankou that we previously mentioned, and then to the wider Chinese market. The Hankou center would later merge in a tri-city conglomeration with the nearby cities of Wuchang and Hanyang to become modern Wuhan. Despite the radical processes of change that we have witnessed in the northern Chinese economy of the Kangxi reign, and in general of the Qing consolidation, there had actually been a much more radical process of change ongoing, and that was more focused on the south of the country. So that is what we are going to be exploring next time.